I sat frozen in the leather chair as Mr. Patterson read the will. My sister Jessica smiled when she heard $7.5 million. Then my father stood up, walked over to me, and placed two $1 bills in my palm. My mother smirked from across the room. Some kids just do not measure up. The family laughed at my public humiliation. 29 years of trying to earn their approval ended with $2. I was about to leave when Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. There was one more document. A letter from Grandpa Henry. As he broke the seal, my mother suddenly stopped laughing. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant living in the shadow of success. My parents, Richard and Eleanor Wright, built Wright Properties from a small residential agency into a commercial real estate empire spanning 3 states. Our colonial-style home sat on 4 acres, complete with tennis courts and an indoor pool that Jessica used for her competitive swimming practice. My sister excelled at everything she touched. Valedictorian, cheerleading captain, and the perfect daughter who eventually graduated from Princeton with honors. I struggled silently with dyslexia until 3rd grade, when my teacher finally noticed what my parents had dismissed as laziness. Even after diagnosis, my mother would sigh dramatically when helping with homework, making comments about how Jessica never needed extra attention. My father would simply leave the room, unable to hide his disappointment in a son who mixed up letters and numbers. Every milestone in our household became another opportunity to highlight the difference between us. On my 10th birthday, Jessica received a new laptop because she might feel left out. She was 14 and already being groomed to understand the family business. My gift that year was a desk planner to help me get organized. The summer after 6th grade, I discovered something that made sense to me. My father had cleaned out the garage and placed several items at the curb, including an old wooden toolbox that belonged to my grandfather Henry. I rescued it before the garbage truck arrived and found inside a collection of woodworking tools still in good condition. Something about the weight of the hand plane and the smell of aged wood felt right in a way that nothing in my academic life ever had. I set up a small workbench in the far corner of the basement, where the water heater hummed loud enough to mask the sounds of my experiments. Using scrap wood from construction dumpsters, I taught myself basic joinery and carving. My parents never noticed my disappearances into the basement. Jessica had begun winning regional swimming competitions, and their attention centered completely on her growing trophy collection. Our father constantly spoke about legacy. Wright Properties would someday belong to the next generation, but his eyes would only rest on Jessica when he mentioned the future. She shadowed him at the office during summer breaks, while I worked various minimum wage jobs that my mother referred to as character-building experiences. Legacy, I learned early, was not meant for me. The only person who showed any interest in my life was Grandpa Henry, but he lived primarily in his Florida retirement community and visited rarely. We exchanged awkward conversation during holiday gatherings, while my father dominated discussions with business talk, and my mother orchestrated perfect family photo opportunities featuring Jessica front and center. The defining moment came during my sophomore year of high school. My grandfather had visited for Thanksgiving and brought with him an antique writing desk that he wanted restored. It was a beautiful piece from the 1920s, with intricate inlay work and brass fittings. He mentioned wanting to find a skilled craftsman to repair several damaged areas, including a drawer that no longer opened properly. 2 days after Thanksgiving, I discovered Jessica using the drawer as a footrest while talking on the phone. When I suggested she be careful with Grandpa Henry's desk, she rolled her eyes and pressed harder until we heard a definitive crack. She left the room without acknowledging what had happened. That night at dinner, my father noticed the broken drawer hanging awkwardly from the desk in the study. Jessica immediately pointed at me. "That broken drawer is Hayden's fault. I saw him messing with it earlier." My attempts to defend myself were drowned out by my father's lecture about respecting family heirlooms and my mother's disappointed head-shaking. I was grounded for 2 weeks, while Jessica received praise for her honesty in reporting the incident. After everyone went to bed that night, I snuck into the study with my toolbox. Working silently by flashlight, I carefully removed the damaged drawer, repaired the broken dovetail joints, reinforced the structure, and even managed to fix the original issue that had prevented smooth operation. I worked until 4 in the morning, applying the skills I had been secretly developing for years. At breakfast, Grandpa Henry discovered the repair and mentioned how smoothly the drawer now operated. "Better than when I brought it," he said, examining the craftsmanship with impressed eyes. My father immediately took credit, claiming he had called in a professional as a surprise. When Grandpa Henry asked for the name of the woodworker to thank him, my father fumbled through an explanation about a handyman who left no business card. I sat silently, watching my grandfather run his fingers along my careful repair work. Our eyes met briefly across the table, and something passed between us that I could not quite identify at the time. It was only years later that I understood that moment marked the first time anyone in my family had seen my true potential, even if it remained unacknowledged. After graduating with my architecture degree from the University of Virginia, I returned home with genuine optimism. Despite years of feeling secondary to Jessica, I believed my education might finally earn me a place in the family legacy. Wright Properties had expanded into commercial development, and I had specifically tailored my studies towards sustainable commercial architecture, thinking I could contribute something meaningful to the company. I prepared a portfolio of my design work and a presentation outlining how sustainable building practices could position Wright Properties at the forefront of a growing market trend. The morning of my scheduled meeting with my parents, I dressed in the suit they had given me as a graduation present and arrived at the company headquarters 15 minutes early. The receptionist, who had known me since childhood, seemed surprised by my appointment. "Mr. and Mrs. Wright are very busy today," she said, checking her computer, "but Jessica can probably squeeze you in for a few minutes." I waited in the lobby for 45 minutes before being escorted to a conference room where my parents and Jessica sat reviewing documents. My father checked his watch impatiently as I set up my presentation. "We only have about 10 minutes, Hayden," my mother said. The Henderson meeting was moved up. I rushed through my carefully prepared slides, explaining how my architectural background could help develop a new division focused on environmentally conscious commercial spaces. As I spoke, my father checked emails on his phone, while my mother and Jessica exchanged glances. When I finished, there was an uncomfortable silence before my father cleared his throat. "Son," he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I had come to recognize, "this is a nice hobby project, but Wright Properties deals with serious development. We already have an entire design department that Jessica oversees," my mother added. "Besides, your sister has an MBA from Wharton. She understands the business side that makes these decisions viable." Jessica smiled sympathetically. "Maybe you could try applying to one of those boutique firms that does those eco-friendly buildings," she suggested. "I could write you a recommendation." The humiliation burned through me as I realized this meeting had never been taken seriously. They had humored me, perhaps out of some obligation after my graduation, but there had never been any intention of bringing me into the company. That night at dinner, when my mother asked about my plans, I announced I was moving to Portland, Oregon. "Portland?" she questioned. "What on earth for?" "I have a friend from college who needs a roommate," I lied. "And there are opportunities for architectural work there." My father barely looked up from his plate. "Probably for the best. You were never really cut out for the pressure of this business anyway." 2 weeks later, I packed everything I owned into my 10-year-old Honda and drove across the country. The truth was I had no job lined up, no roommate waiting, and only about $4,000 in savings. What I did have was a determination to prove my worth on my own terms. Portland turned out to be both harder and more rewarding than I had imagined. I found a studio apartment in a rundown building on the outskirts of the city and took whatever jobs I could find to cover rent. Barista in the mornings, restaurant server in the evenings, and occasional weekend work as a carpenter's assistant, where I could use the skills I had been developing since childhood. 6 months into this exhausting schedule, I finally saved enough to rent a tiny workshop space in an industrial building shared by various craftspeople. The space had no heating, unreliable electricity, and a roof that leaked during Oregon's frequent rains, but it was mine. I scavenged materials from construction site dumpsters and estate sales, slowly building an inventory of tools and wood. My first attempts at creating furniture for sale were disasters. Proportions were off, finishes uneven, and joints that seemed tight would mysteriously loosen after a few days. I spent countless nights hunched over woodworking books and watching online tutorials, learning through endless trial and error. My hands became calloused and scarred from minor injuries that I could not afford to have properly treated. Meals consisted primarily of ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches as every spare dollar went back into the workshop. My parents rarely called, and when they did, the conversations were brief. My mother would detail Jessica's latest promotion or accomplishment, while my father would interrupt with questions about when I planned to get a real job. I never mentioned the workshop or my furniture. Their dismissal of my architecture career had taught me to protect the things that mattered most from their criticism. After nearly a year of struggle, I finally created a dining table that met my standards. Made from reclaimed Douglas fir with black walnut accents, it featured hand-cut joinery and a natural oil finish that highlighted the wood grain. I posted photos on a local maker's website, pricing it barely above the cost of materials and labor. 3 weeks passed with no interest. Then, as I was about to reduce the price further, I received an email inquiry about the table. The message was brief, asking if the piece was still available and if I had other examples of my work. I quickly created a basic website showing the few completed pieces in my collection and waited. The response came the next day with a request to visit my workshop. I spent the entire night cleaning the space, hiding the sleeping bag I occasionally used when working too late to return to my apartment. The prospective client had only given a name, H. Wright, and a local hotel as reference. At 10 the next morning, a rental car pulled up to my workshop. I watched through the window as an elderly man carefully exited the vehicle and made his way to the entrance. When he removed his sunglasses, I found myself staring into a face I had not seen in nearly 2 years. Grandpa Henry stood in my doorway, looking smaller and more frail than I remembered, but with the same sharp eyes that had once noticed my repair work on his antique desk. "Well," he said, surveying my modest workshop, "are you going to invite your grandfather in, or should I stand here catching pneumonia?" The shock of seeing him rendered me temporarily speechless. I had never mentioned my location to my parents, and as far as I knew, no one in the family had my Portland address. Reading my confusion, he chuckled. "Your mother mentioned you had moved to Portland. Took a private investigator about 2 days to find you. Now, show me this table you made." I guided him through the workshop, explaining my process and showing him the table that had brought him there. He ran his hands over the surface, examined the joinery, and tested the stability with a critical eye. "You know," he finally said, "this reminds me of a piece I saw in an exhibition in Chicago back in the 70s. Same attention to how the grain patterns flow across the surface. That was made by a fellow who later became quite famous. His works now sell for hundreds of thousands." I mumbled something about being nowhere near that level, but Grandpa Henry waved away my modesty. "I want to commission a desk from you," he announced. "Something for my home office in Florida. Money is no object for quality craftsmanship." He proceeded to describe exactly what he wanted: a partner's desk with specific dimensions, storage requirements, and wood species. The project would take months and require materials I could barely afford to purchase up front. When I hesitantly mentioned a price that seemed fair but accounted for the extensive work involved, he immediately doubled it and offered to pay half as a deposit. Before leaving, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "This is just between us, Hayden. Your father has strong opinions about what constitutes appropriate career choices. I prefer to make my own judgments." That desk commission changed everything. With the deposit, I could purchase proper tools, quality materials, and even install heating in my workshop. More importantly, it gave me the confidence to pursue furniture making as more than just a stubborn act of independence from my family. The next 2 years brought an unexpected development into my life. Grandpa Henry began visiting Portland every few months, ostensibly to check on the progress of his desk, which I had completed within 6 months, but clearly for something more. Each visit would follow a similar pattern. He would arrive unannounced at my workshop, inspect my latest pieces with a craftsman's eye, and then invite me to dinner at whatever high-end restaurant had caught his attention. During these meals, we developed a relationship entirely separate from the rest of the Wright family. I learned that before founding what eventually became Wright Properties, Henry had worked as a structural engineer with a passion for innovative design. The company began not as a real estate agency, as my father had always claimed, but as an architectural design firm specializing in commercial spaces that maximized natural light and energy efficiency, concepts revolutionary for their time. When my father took over in the 1990s, He had shifted focus entirely to acquisition and development, abandoning the design principles that had been the company's foundation. "Your father sees buildings as assets on a balance sheet," Henry explained during one visit. "I always saw them as living spaces that could either enhance or diminish human experience. That's why your architecture degree interested me. You understood the part of the business Richard chose to forget." These conversations revealed a family history my parents had never shared. Grandpa Henry had grown up during the Depression, the son of a carpenter who could rarely find steady work. He put himself through engineering school, working nights and weekends, often going without meals to pay for textbooks. His early career was marked by similar struggles to my own current situation, hand-to-mouth existence while trying to build something meaningful. The family wealth that my parents treated as evidence of their business acumen had actually been established through Grandpa Henry's decades of innovation and hard work before they ever entered the picture. One evening, after his third Manhattan, Henry confided something that shocked me. "You remind me of myself at your age," he said, the whiskey making him unusually sentimental. "Same stubbornness, same attention to detail, same refusal to take the easy path. Richard was always more like his mother, ambitious, socially adept, focused on appearances. Nothing wrong with that, of course. But he never understood the joy of creating something with your own hands." I asked why he had sold him the company if they had such different visions. Henry stared into his drink for a long moment. "Sometimes we make decisions based on what we think family loyalty requires," he finally said. "But I am not sure I made the right choice. There is a difference between ambition and stewardship." Over time, I began sharing more details about my own struggles and small victories. How I had finally secured representation in 2 local galleries that specialized in handcrafted furniture. How I had moved to a larger workshop space and hired a part-time assistant. How I was developing a distinctive style that combined traditional joinery with contemporary lines, creating pieces that were both functional and sculptural. Henry listened with genuine interest, asking questions about technical challenges and business strategies. Unlike my parents, he never seemed to compare my path to Jessica's or suggest that financial success was the only measure of worth. He simply appreciated the craft for what it was, the creation of beautiful, useful objects that would outlive their maker. During what would turn out to be his final visit to Portland, Henry arrived looking noticeably thinner, with a pallor that concerned me immediately. When I asked about his health, he dismissed my worry with a wave of his hand. "Just a touch of something the doctors are sorting out," he said. "Now show me what you are working on." I had recently begun experimenting with incorporating metal elements into my wooden pieces, a series of side tables with bronze inlays, and a dining set with custom-forged hardware. Henry spent hours examining these new works, asking detailed questions about my process and offering suggestions based on his engineering background. That evening, instead of going out, he asked if we could talk privately in my workshop. He settled into the leather armchair I kept for clients and fixed me with an intense gaze. "I need to commission one more piece from you," he said. "Something special, a memory box with hidden compartments." He proceeded to describe an elaborate document box with multiple secret drawers, accessible only through a specific sequence of movements. When I asked what it would hold, he simply smiled. Some things a man wants to keep private until the right moment. As he prepared to leave the next morning, Henry handed me an envelope containing far more money than the commission warranted, along with detailed drawings for the box. Before I could protest, he embraced me for the first time in our adult relationship. "You have found your calling, Hayden," he said. "Never let anyone convince you it is worth any less because it did not come with the family name attached." There was a finality to his words that troubled me, but he quickly changed the subject, asking about shipping details for the memory box and promising to call when he returned to Florida. 2 weeks after completing and shipping the memory box, I received the call I had been dreading. Not from Henry, but from a nurse at Portland General Hospital. My grandfather had collapsed during his flight home and had been admitted to the cardiac unit. He had given my name as his emergency contact. I arrived at the hospital to find Grandpa Henry connected to multiple monitors, his normally commanding presence diminished by the institutional setting. When he saw me, he attempted a smile that turned into a grimace. "Not exactly how I planned my next visit," he joked weakly. The doctor later explained that Henry had known about his condition for months stage 4 pancreatic cancer that had spread to his liver. He had refused aggressive treatment, opting instead for palliative care that would allow him to maintain his independence as long as possible. I called my parents immediately, despite Henry's protests. "No need to disturb them," he insisted. "Richard is probably in the middle of some important deal." But within hours, my father had chartered a private jet from Connecticut. By evening, my parents and Jessica had arrived at the hospital, bringing with them the familiar dynamics I had managed to escape for nearly 3 years. My mother swept into the room in designer clothing entirely inappropriate for a hospital visit, air-kissing Henry before turning to me with a critical eye. "Hayden, you look thin," she observed. "And what is that beard? You know you have never had the face structure for facial hair." My father immediately began questioning the doctors about treatment options and specialists, throwing around the names of board members he knew at major research hospitals. Jessica occupied herself with organizing a schedule for the family to follow, complete with color-coded spreadsheets and rotation assignments. Amid their flurry of activity, no one seemed to notice that Henry had stopped speaking, his eyes closed against the sudden invasion of his private struggle. I quietly suggested they continue their planning in the family waiting room, allowing him to rest. My mother looked surprised, as if she had forgotten Henry was actually present. Over the next several days, a pattern emerged. My parents and Jessica would appear during daytime hours, filling the room with loud conversations about people Henry barely remembered and business matters he no longer had interest in. They brought expensive flowers that triggered his nausea and gourmet food he could not eat. Each evening, they would depart for their luxury hotel, explaining they needed proper rest to be effective advocates for his care. I took the night shifts, sleeping in the uncomfortable recliner beside his bed, helping the nurses turn him, and simply sitting in companionable silence when sleep eluded him. During these quiet hours, Henry would sometimes share fragments of stories I had never heard the early days of his marriage, business gambles that had paid off against all odds, regrets about decisions made decades ago. One night, about a week into this arrangement, my father arrived unexpectedly at 11:30. I had been reading aloud from Henry's favorite Patrick O'Brian novel, and we both looked up in surprise. "Dad," I said, "I thought you were at the Heathman Hotel." My father ignored me, addressing Henry directly. "We need to discuss some business matters," he said, privately. Something in his tone made me reluctant to leave, but Henry nodded slightly, indicating it was okay. I stepped into the hallway, but remained close enough to intervene if needed. Through the partially open door, I heard my father's voice drop to an urgent whisper. "The Henderson acquisition is stalling without your signature on the trust documents. We need to move now, or lose the opportunity entirely." Henry's reply was too quiet for me to hear clearly, but my father's response was immediate and harsh. "This is not the time for second thoughts. We have investors committed based on your verbal agreement. If you back out now, the damage to the company will be severe." Their conversation continued for several minutes, with my father's voice growing increasingly frustrated, while Henry remained calm but firm. Eventually, my father emerged from the room, his face flushed with anger. He strode past without acknowledging me. When I returned to Henry's bedside, he appeared exhausted but somehow more at peace than he had been all week. "Your father and I have different visions for the future of Wright Properties," he said simply. "Sometimes it takes the end of a life to clarify what truly matters." The next morning brought an unexpected development. My parents announced they needed to return to Connecticut for an urgent business situation, promising to be back in a few days. Jessica would remain another day to organize Henry's care schedule with the hospital staff before joining them. After they departed, Henry seemed to rally slightly. His appetite improved, and he began talking more about his life, as if determined to share important memories while he still could. During one of these conversations, he asked the nurse for privacy, then reached for my hand. "There is something I need you to have," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. From beneath his pillow, he withdrew a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "This contains things you should know," he continued, "but promise me you will not read it until after I am gone. Some truths are easier to face when their messenger is no longer present to witness the pain they cause." I promised, tucking the journal into my jacket. Henry nodded, satisfied, then changed the subject to ask about my latest furniture designs as if the mysterious transfer had never occurred. That night, Henry's condition deteriorated rapidly. His breathing became labored, and the nurses increased his pain medication, warning me that he might not remain conscious much longer. I called my parents immediately, but reached only their voicemail. Jessica's phone similarly went unanswered. As dawn approached, Henry opened his eyes with surprising clarity. "Remember what matters, Hayden," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "Legacy is not about money or buildings. It is about truth and creating something that improves the lives it touches." Those were his last coherent words. 2 hours later, with only myself and a kind nurse present, Henry Wright took his final breath. When my parents and Jessica arrived the following afternoon, having apparently been in meetings too important to interrupt, their grief manifested as anger directed primarily at me. "You should have made them try resuscitation," my mother accused, despite the DNR order Henry had signed months earlier. My father paced the now empty hospital room. "I cannot believe he went without us here, after everything we have done for him." Jessica busied herself calling family friends and arranging the details of a funeral service that would, as she explained, properly honor our grandfather's position in the community. Through it all, the weight of Henry's journal pressed against my chest from its place in my inner pocket, a secret yet to be revealed. In the hospital waiting room, as my father spoke with the doctor about death certificates and necessary paperwork, my mother cornered me with unexpected venom. "I hope you did not get any ideas during all this private time with Henry," she hissed. "We are well aware of your financial struggles with that little woodworking hobby. If you think you have somehow positioned yourself for special treatment in his will, you are going to be severely disappointed." The accusation stunned me, not just for its cruelty, but for what it revealed about my mother's assumptions regarding my relationship with my grandfather. "Henry helped me because he believed in my work," I responded. "Unlike some people, he actually took the time to see what I was creating." My mother's expression hardened. "Always the sensitive artist," she said dismissively. "That is why you will never succeed in this family, Hayden. You simply do not have what it takes." As we left the hospital, Jessica informed me that the will reading would take place in 2 weeks, followed by a memorial service at the country club where Henry had maintained a membership despite rarely using it. "You will be there, of course," she added, giving me a critical once-over. "Try to find something appropriate to wear. This is an important family occasion." The unspoken message was clear. For the public performance of grief, all Wright family members were expected to present a united front, regardless of the fractures beneath the surface. 2 weeks after Henry's death, I found myself sitting in the wood-paneled conference room of Patterson, Winters and Associates, the law firm that had handled Wright family legal matters for 3 generations. I had flown back from Portland that morning, wearing the only suit I owned, a navy blue ensemble purchased for job interviews years earlier that now hung loosely on my frame after years of physical labor in my workshop. My parents and Jessica arrived precisely 5 minutes before the scheduled reading, dressed immaculately as always. My father nodded curtly in my direction, while my mother limited her greeting to a critical assessment of my appearance. "You could have at least shaved for the occasion," she remarked, before taking a seat as far from me as the conference table allowed. Jessica positioned herself between our parents, the 3 of them forming a united front across from me. The family configuration felt symbolic of the divisions that had defined our relationships for as long as I could remember. Mr. Patterson, a grave man in his 60s who had served as the family attorney since before my birth, entered precisely at 10 o'clock, carrying a leather portfolio and several document folders. He offered condolences to the family collectively before seating himself at the head of the table. "Henry Wright was a careful and meticulous man," he began, particularly when it came to his final affairs. "He revised his will multiple times over the past year, with the final version signed and notarized just 3 weeks before his passing." My father leaned forward impatiently. "We all have commitments this afternoon, George. Perhaps we could move directly to the relevant distributions?" Mr. Patterson's expression remained professionally neutral as he opened the first folder. "As you wish, Richard. I will proceed with the reading of the last will and testament of Henry Wright." What followed was a detailed accounting of my grandfather's estate, beginning with various charitable donations to educational institutions and medical research foundations. Small bequests were made to longtime employees and several distant relatives. With each item, My father's impatience grew more visible, his fingers drumming against the polished conference table. Finally, Mr. Patterson reached the main distribution of assets. To my granddaughter, Jessica Wright, he read, I leave the sum of $7,500,000, ownership of the properties at 47 Ocean Drive in Palm Beach, Florida and 16 Lakeview Terrace in Greenwich, Connecticut, along with 75% controlling interest in Wright Properties, with the expectation that she will continue to uphold the company's position in the industry. Jessica's composed smile could not quite hide her triumph as she reached across the table to squeeze our mother's hand. Eleanor Wright's eyes glistened with what appeared to be tears of pride. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat and continued, and to my grandson, Hayden Wright. The room grew silent as everyone turned toward me. I felt a strange mix of emotions, anticipation, resignation, and an unexpected hope that perhaps Henry had found some way to acknowledge our connection. The attorney paused, seeming slightly uncomfortable for the first time since beginning the reading. Before he could continue, my father stood abruptly. I believe I should handle this part personally, George, he said, reaching into his suit jacket. Mr. Patterson frowned but did not object. As my father withdrew his wallet and approached my side of the table, with deliberate slowness, he extracted 2 crisp $1 bills and placed them in front of me. To my grandson, Hayden Wright, my father continued, clearly delivering lines he had prepared, I leave the sum of $2, with the suggestion that he finally learn to earn his own way in life, as I had to do. The shock must have registered plainly on my face, because my mother chose that moment to add her own commentary. Some kids just do not measure up, she said, her voice carrying the familiar note of disappointment that had punctuated my childhood. Perhaps this will finally motivate you to abandon your little wood hobby and find a real profession. Jessica covered her mouth, but not quickly enough to hide her smile. The 3 of them exchanged glances that communicated years of shared opinion about my place in the family hierarchy. I stared at the $2 bills lying on the table before me, the ultimate symbol of my grandfather's supposed dismissal. After years of connection, conversations, and what I had believed was genuine respect for my craft, this public humiliation seemed inconceivable. You could use it for bus fare back to your workshop, Jessica suggested, unable to resist adding to my embarrassment. I folded the bills carefully and placed them in my pocket, struggling to maintain composure as I processed what seemed to be my final rejection from the Wright family legacy. The weight of Henry's journal, which I had carried with me to the reading but had not yet found the courage to open, pressed against my chest like a stone. Are we finished here? My father asked Mr. Patterson, already reaching for his suit jacket. The attorney's expression remained unreadable as he responded, Not quite yet. There is one additional document that must be addressed according to Mr. Wright's explicit instructions. From his portfolio, Mr. Patterson withdrew a sealed envelope, the paper heavy and cream-colored, with Henry Wright's distinctive handwriting visible on the front. This letter is to be read aloud immediately following the will distribution, he explained. Mr. Wright was most insistent on this point. My mother's expression shifted suddenly from satisfaction to wariness. Surely that is unnecessary, George, she said quickly. We have already covered the essentials of the will, and as Richard mentioned, we have other commitments this afternoon. I'm afraid this is not optional, Eleanor, Mr. Patterson replied, his tone firmer than before. It is a legally binding component of Henry's final wishes, and I am obligated to fulfill my duty as executor. As he broke the seal on the envelope, I noticed my mother's posture stiffen, her earlier smugness replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear. My father had returned to his seat but sat forward tensely, his earlier confidence visibly shaken. Mr. Patterson adjusted his reading glasses and began to read in a clear, measured voice. If this letter is being read, then I, Henry Wright, am no longer present to witness the events that will follow. I have arranged my will in a specific manner to reveal the true character of those who believe themselves entitled to my legacy. The attorney paused briefly, glancing up at the suddenly silent family before continuing. To those who may be surprised or confused by the distributions just announced, allow me to provide context that has long been withheld from family discussion. Wright Properties was founded not by Richard Wright, as family mythology now claims, but by myself in 1958, as Wright Architectural Engineering. The company's initial success came through my patented structural designs for commercial buildings that reduced energy consumption by 30% compared to industry standards of the time designs that continue to generate licensing revenue through their adaptations in modern green building practices. My mother's face had gone pale, while my father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Jessica looked between them with growing confusion. When Richard joined the company in 1987, Mr. Comedy, Patterson read, he demonstrated considerable talent for business development, but limited appreciation for the innovative principles upon which the firm was built. By 1994, through a series of legal maneuvers executed while I was recovering from heart surgery, control of the company was transferred from my name to Richard and Eleanor Wright, with the original patents and intellectual property rights obscured through newly created subsidiary holdings. My father stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous," he interrupted. Henry was a willing participant in the company reorganization. He signed all the documents voluntarily. Mr. Patterson continued reading, as if no interruption had occurred. What my son and daughter-in-law did not know was that I maintained separate legal ownership of the original patents and intellectual property through a holding company established in 1973. These assets, including all derived licensing agreements, have never been part of Wright Properties as it exists today, and therefore were never subject to Richard's acquisition of the company. The room had grown so quiet that the sound of Jessica's sharp intake of breath seemed unnaturally loud. These intellectual property assets, which generate approximately $4.6 million annually through licensing agreements with 17 international development firms, I hereby leave in their entirety to my grandson, Hayden Wright, along with full ownership of the holding company that controls them, Wright Innovations Limited. My mother made a strange, choked sound as Mr. Patterson turned to the next page and continued. Additionally, having observed Hayden's character, work ethic, and creative vision over recent years, I established a separate trust in his name in 2021, with an initial funding of $12 million. This trust has been managed independently by Cornerstone Financial Services and remains entirely separate from family assets. Full control of this trust transfers to Hayden upon my death, with Mr. Patterson serving as trustee until transfer is complete. The attorney looked directly at me as he read the next section. Hayden, if you are wondering why I never mentioned these arrangements during our time together, I wanted to ensure that our relationship remained untainted by financial considerations. The connection we formed was based on genuine respect and shared values, not expectation of inheritance. I felt a surge of emotion hearing Henry's words, validating what I had always believed about our relationship. Across the table, my father's face had turned an alarming shade of red, while my mother gripped the arms of her chair with white knuckles. Mr. Patterson turned to the final page of the letter. There is one last matter that must be addressed. During the final years of my life, I became increasingly concerned about certain business practices adopted by Wright Properties under current management. I engaged private investigators who documented evidence of tax fraud, misappropriation of investor funds, and falsification of environmental compliance records spanning the past decade. This evidence, including financial records, emails, and witness statements, has been securely preserved in a custom memory box crafted by Hayden, with copies provided to Mr. Patterson to be released to appropriate authorities if necessary. My mother stood suddenly, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. This is slander. Henry was confused in his final months. These ridiculous accusations. Mr. Patterson held up a hand, silencing her outburst. Richard and Eleanor. The letter continued. I have given you the opportunity to build wealth and success based on the foundation I created. Instead of stewarding that legacy with integrity, you have chosen paths that dishonor everything I worked to build. The consequences of those choices now rest with you. Finally, to Jessica, I leave this advice. True success is measured not by what we accumulate, but by what we create and how we treat others along the way. Perhaps this lesson comes too late for your parents, but I hope not for you. With these truths finally spoken, I bid farewell to the Wright family as it has existed until now. May what follows bring justice, reconciliation, and a return to the principles of integrity upon which our name was originally built. The letter was signed simply, Henry Wright, with the date marking just 3 weeks before his death. As Mr. Patterson folded the letter and returned it to its envelope, my mother collapsed back into her chair, her earlier composure completely shattered. "He cannot do this," she whispered. "It is not legal." "I assure you, Mrs. Wright," the attorney responded. "Everything outlined in this letter is legally binding and thoroughly documented." Mr. Wright was meticulous in his planning. My father's face had moved from red to ashen as the implications of Henry's revelations sank in. The tax fraud allegations alone could result in criminal charges, not to mention the potential investor lawsuits once word of falsified records became public. "This is your fault," he suddenly spat in my direction. "You turned him against us during those visits," filled his head with lies about the company. Before I could respond, Mr. Patterson intervened. "Mr. Wright, I suggest you consider your next actions very carefully. The evidence gathered by your father is substantial and has been reviewed by my firm. Attempting to place blame elsewhere will not improve your situation." Jessica sat in stunned silence, her earlier triumph transformed into confusion and growing alarm as she processed the dramatic reversal of fortunes. I found myself strangely calm amid the chaos unfolding across the conference table. The journal in my pocket no longer felt like a burden, but rather a final connection to the man who had seen value in me when my own parents could not. Mr. Patterson turned to me. "Hayden, there are several documents requiring your signature to complete the transfer of assets. Would you like to proceed now? Or would you prefer to schedule a separate meeting?" The question hung in the air as my family watched, with expressions ranging from shock to fury to calculation. In that moment, I understood that whatever I decided would fundamentally alter the course of all our lives. "Now would be fine," I answered quietly. "I believe Grandpa Henry has waited long enough for the truth to come to light." After signing the necessary documents in Mr. Patterson's office, I declined his offer to explain the full extent of my inheritance immediately. The weight of the morning's revelations felt overwhelming, and I needed time to process everything that had occurred. Instead, I asked for a day to review Henry's journal before our next meeting. My parents and Jessica had departed without speaking further to me, their shocked silence more telling than any words could have been. As I walked back to my hotel room through streets lined with autumn leaves, I felt oddly disconnected from the dramatic scene that had just unfolded. For so many years, I had sought approval from people who had never intended to give it, measuring my worth against standards designed to ensure my failure. In the privacy of my room, I finally opened the leather journal that Henry had entrusted to me during his final days. The first entry was dated 1958, the year he founded the company that would eventually become Wright Properties. His neat, precise handwriting filled page after page with observations about architecture, engineering challenges, and his vision for buildings that served human needs while respecting environmental limitations, concepts remarkably advanced for their time. As I read further, the journal chronicled Henry's journey from struggling engineer to successful innovator, documenting the patents that formed the foundation of his business. There were sketches of building designs, calculations for structural elements, and notes about materials that combined strength with energy efficiency. Throughout, his passion for creation and problem-solving shone through in every entry. The tone of the journal shifted noticeably around 1987, when my father joined the company fresh from business school. Early entries expressed hope about Richard's potential, noting his charisma and ambition as positive traits that could help expand the business. But gradually, concerns began to appear. "Richard sees only growth and acquisition," Henry wrote in 1990. "He speaks of legacy but seems uninterested in the principles that built this company. Eleanor encourages this focus on expansion at all costs. I worry about the direction they envision." By 1993, the entries grew increasingly troubled, documenting disagreements about company direction and values. Henry described attempts to protect his original patents by transferring them to a separate holding company structure that could preserve them regardless of what happened to Wright Properties itself. The most painful entries came during 1994, when Henry suffered a major heart attack followed by bypass surgery. During his recovery, Richard and Eleanor had apparently executed legal maneuvers that effectively transferred control of the main company to themselves, leaving Henry as a figurehead with diminishing influence. "They presented documents while I was still heavily medicated," he wrote. By the time I fully understood what I had signed, the restructuring was complete. My son views this as smart business. I view it as betrayal of everything I tried to teach him about integrity. The entries grew sporadic after that, with years sometimes passing between them. Henry documented his gradual withdrawal from company operations and his increasing disillusionment with what Wright Properties had become under Richard and Eleanor's leadership. He noted his decision to retire to Florida, effectively removing himself from family business matters entirely. Then, 3 years ago, a new energy appeared in the journal entries coinciding with Henry's first visit to my workshop in Portland. "Saw Hayden's furniture today," he wrote. "The craftsmanship shows attention to detail and material that reminds me of my early work. There is integrity in how he joins pieces without hiding shortcuts behind veneer or filler. He has found his medium for expression, just as I found mine in structural design. For the first time in years, I feel hopeful about the Wright legacy continuing, though not in the way Richard would recognize." Subsequent entries detailed Henry's growing connection with me, his appreciation for my development as a craftsman, and his quiet pride in my determination to succeed on my own terms. He wrote about investigating Wright Properties' business practices after becoming suspicious during conversations with former colleagues, and his growing alarm at what his private investigators uncovered. The final entry was dated just 1 week before his hospitalization in Portland. "All arrangements are now in place," he wrote. "The evidence is secured, the assets protected, and my true wishes documented. Richard and Eleanor will face the consequences of their choices, though I take no joy in what must come. Jessica has been shaped by their values, but may yet find her own path. And Hayden has already demonstrated the character and vision that represents the best of what I hope to create in this world. When I am gone, the truth will finally be spoken aloud, and whatever follows will at least be built on honesty rather than deception." The journal ended there, its final pages blank, waiting for a continuation that would never come in Henry's hand. I closed the book as evening shadows lengthened across my hotel room. The grandfather I had come to know in recent years had been playing a long game, carefully observing, documenting, and preparing for a reckoning he knew would come after his death. He had protected me from the burden of this knowledge while he lived, allowing our relationship to develop naturally, based on shared values rather than strategic positioning. As night fell, my phone began ringing with calls from various family members, more distant aunts, uncles, and cousins, who had somehow heard snippets of what had transpired at the will reading. I let each call go to voicemail, not yet ready to navigate the shifting family dynamics or explain situations I was still processing myself. Just after midnight, a text message arrived from Jessica, a simple request to meet for coffee the following morning. No demands, no accusations, just an acknowledgement that we perhaps had things to discuss before the memorial service scheduled for the afternoon. I replied with agreement and a suggested location, then tried to sleep, my mind still swirling with revelations and possibilities that would have seemed inconceivable just 24 hours earlier. The next morning I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, choosing a table near the back that offered some privacy. Jessica appeared precisely on time, looking uncharacteristically subdued in simple black clothing rather than her usual designer attire. For a moment, she stood awkwardly by the table, as if uncertain of her welcome. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, attempting a smile that did not reach her eyes. I gestured for her to sit, noting the absence of the confidence that had defined her presence throughout our lives. We ordered coffee in silence, neither quite ready to broach the chasm that had opened between us. Finally, Jessica spoke, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the cafe. "Did you know about Grandpa Henry's plans, the trust, any of it?" I shook my head. He never mentioned money during any of our conversations. We talked about woodworking, design principles, his early career. Sometimes he shared stories about the family that I had never heard before. But he never once hinted at what he had arranged. Jessica nodded slowly, turning her coffee cup in small circles on the table. "Mom and Dad are meeting with their lawyers today. They are considering contesting the will, claiming Henry was not of sound mind." The suggestion might have angered me a day earlier, but now I felt only a weary sadness for the predictable response. "Henry anticipated that," I said. "The journal he left me documents his concerns and decisions going back decades. His lawyer has copies of everything, including the evidence of financial irregularities. Jessica winced at the mention of irregularities, but did not deny their existence. "Were you with him? At the end?" "Yes," I said simply. He was lucid and at peace. His final words were about creating things that improve the lives they touch, about what true legacy means. She blinked rapidly, fighting tears that seemed to surprise her with their intensity. "I never really knew him, did I? Mom and Dad always presented him as this outdated businessman who did not understand modern markets, but he built everything they have." "Everything they had," I corrected gently. "Those assets may be in jeopardy now, depending on how they choose to proceed." Jessica nodded, the reality of their situation clearly still sinking in. "They want me to join the lawsuit," she admitted, "to testify about Henry's mental state during his hospital stay. They are promising to protect my portion of the inheritance if I help them." "And will you?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. She met my gaze directly for perhaps the first time in our adult lives. "I do not know who I am without the identity they created for me," she confessed. "The perfect daughter, the business prodigy, the heir to the right empire. If that all disappears, what is left?" The vulnerability in her question surprised me. Throughout our childhood, Jessica had always seemed so completely formed, so confident in her place and purpose. The idea that she might harbor her own insecurities had never occurred to me. "Maybe that is something worth discovering," I suggested. "Who Jessica might be when she is not playing a role assigned by our parents." She considered this for a long moment before asking the question that perhaps had brought her to this meeting in the first place. "What are you going to do, Hayden? About the company, the evidence, all of it?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications for the entire family's future. I had been considering this same question through the sleepless night, weighing options and potential consequences. "I have not decided yet," I answered truthfully. "But whatever happens, it will be about moving forward, not punishing the past." "That is what Henry would have wanted." Jessica nodded, a tentative relief visible in her expression. As we finished our coffee and prepared to go our separate ways before the memorial service, she paused. "For what it is worth," she said quietly, "I always admired how you just left and built your own life. I never had that kind of courage." Before I could respond to this unexpected confession, she walked away, leaving me to wonder if perhaps Henry's final act had created an opening not just for justice, but for healing as well. That afternoon, as family members gathered to honor Henry's memory, I observed my parents carefully managing their public personas, giving no indication of the turmoil behind their composed exteriors. I delivered a brief eulogy, focusing on Henry's innovation and vision, his belief in creating structures that would outlast their creator. The subtle message was not lost on those who had heard rumors of the will's contents. After the service, Mr. Patterson approached me with a simple black portfolio. "When you are ready to discuss next steps," he said, "these documents outline your options regarding right innovations and the evidence of financial misconduct." Henry was clear that these decisions should be entirely yours, with no pressure regarding timing or outcomes. I accepted the portfolio, feeling its weight as both burden and opportunity. Whatever choices lay ahead would shape not just my future, but the legacy of the right name for generations to come. 6 months after Grandpa Henry's memorial service, I sat in what had once been my father's office at Wright Properties headquarters, now temporarily mine as interim CEO. The view of the Connecticut coastline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, autumn sunlight dancing across the water. On the desk before me lay the final documents requiring my signature, representing months of negotiation, legal consultation, and difficult family conversations. The path to this moment had been neither straight nor easy. After careful review of the evidence Henry had collected, I faced a profound choice: pursue criminal charges against my parents for years of financial misconduct, or seek an alternative resolution that might salvage something worthwhile from the situation. With Mr. Patterson's guidance, I had chosen a middle path. The evidence was presented to authorities, but with my recommendation for leniency in exchange for full cooperation and restitution. My parents initially responded with threats and denial, but as the strength of the case against them became clear, They reluctantly agreed to the terms offered. Richard and Eleanor Wright ultimately pled guilty to reduced charges of tax evasion and securities fraud. Rather than the potential 20-year sentences such crimes typically carried, they received 5 years of probation, substantial fines, and community service requirements. The agreement required their complete withdrawal from Wright Properties and restrictions on future business activities. The company itself underwent comprehensive restructuring. I established an independent board of directors comprised of industry experts committed to ethical business practices. The focus shifted back toward Henry's original vision: innovative, sustainable commercial developments that prioritized environmental responsibility alongside profitability. Most significantly, I directed the company's resources toward affordable housing initiatives in communities where Wright Properties had previously concentrated on luxury developments. This realignment of priorities initially alarmed shareholders until quarterly reports demonstrated that ethical business could indeed be profitable business. Jessica's journey during these months surprised everyone, perhaps herself most of all. After declining to join our parents' initial attempts to contest the will, she had requested a 6-month leave of absence to, in her words, figure out who I am when no one is telling me who to be. She traveled solo through Southeast Asia, volunteering with habitat restoration projects and studying sustainable building techniques in developing communities. Her occasional emails revealed someone discovering new aspects of herself, freed from the narrow identity she had occupied for 30 years. Upon returning, she asked for a position within Wright Properties that no one expected: environmental compliance officer, starting at entry level despite her previous executive status. She wanted to learn the business from the ground up, she explained, but this time through the lens of responsibility rather than profit. Today marked her return to the company in this new capacity. She was due in my office any minute to discuss the initiative she had developed during her training period, a certification program for ethical business practices that could become an industry standard. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Jessica entered, dressed simply in business casual attire, rather than the designer suits that had once been her uniform. The changes in her went beyond clothing. She carried herself differently, with a quiet confidence that seemed more authentic than her previous polished persona. "The prodigal sister returns," she said with a small smile, taking the seat across from me, but hopefully wiser this time. I returned her smile, still adjusting to this new dynamic between us. "The proposal you sent over looks solid. The board is interested, especially the third-party verification component." We talked business for 30 minutes, discussing implementation details and potential challenges. The ease of our conversation would have been unimaginable a year earlier, when every interaction had been laden with competition and family politics. As our meeting concluded, Jessica hesitated before rising to leave. "Have you heard from them?" she asked, the question gentle but direct. "Mom called last week," I acknowledged. "The community service at the Veterans Center seems to be good for her. She is teaching financial literacy classes. And Dad? Still struggling," I admitted. His identity was so completely tied to his business reputation that losing it has been difficult for him to process. But his therapist reports some progress. He has started mentoring former inmates on building trade skills. Jessica nodded, her expression thoughtful. "They made their choices," she said. "But I am glad you found a way to hold them accountable without destroying them completely." "Henry would have wanted that," I replied. "Justice with the possibility of redemption." After Jessica left, I turned my attention to the construction plans spread across the desk plans for Wright Innovation Center, a combined workspace and educational facility scheduled to break ground in Portland the following month. The center would provide affordable studio space for craftspeople and designers, along with training programs for at-risk youth interested in traditional building skills. My own workshop would occupy the top floor, allowing me to continue creating custom furniture while overseeing both the center and my responsibilities to Wright Properties. The design incorporated many of Henry's original architectural innovations, updated with current sustainable technology, a bridge between past and future. As evening approached, I signed the final approval documents and gathered my things. My flight back to Oregon left early the next morning, and I had promised to have dinner with Jessica before leaving. Our monthly siblings' dinner had become an unexpected tradition during the rebuilding process, a chance to develop the relationship we had never properly had as children. Driving toward the restaurant, I passed the country club, where we had held Henry's memorial service. The memory prompted me to detour briefly to the small cemetery where he was buried. His headstone was simple Vermont granite, the inscription reading only, "Henry Wright, builder of things that last." I stood quietly by the grave, the autumn wind rustling through nearby maple trees. So much had changed in 6 months' time, spent unraveling decades of deception, rebuilding a company founded on sounder principles, and perhaps most surprisingly, discovering a sister I had never really known beneath the golden child persona. "Thank you for seeing what others missed," I said to the quiet stone, "for believing there was something worth salvaging in both me and the right legacy." The early evening sun broke through clouds, casting long shadows across the cemetery. In that moment, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me throughout childhood and early adulthood. The certainty that my worth was not determined by others' assessment, but by the integrity of my own choices and creations. Later, as Jessica and I shared dinner, our conversation turned toward future plans rather than past grievances. She described her ideas for expanding the ethical business certification program nationally. I outlined my vision for additional innovation centers in underserved communities. As we prepared to leave, Jessica raised her glass in a quiet toast. "To Grandpa Henry," she said, "who gave us both a second chance at defining what the right name really means." I clinked my glass against hers, adding, "and to building things that last." The next morning, as my plane lifted off the Connecticut runway toward Oregon, I opened my laptop to review design plans for my next furniture commission, a crib crafted from sustainable hardwoods for my first child, due in 4 months. My wife Emily and I had met during the renovation of my Portland workshop space, her architectural expertise complementing my craftsmanship in ways that constantly surprised and delighted me. Beside the design drawings lay Henry's leather journal, now complemented by my own entries continuing the legacy of documentation and reflection he had begun decades earlier. Someday, I would share both journals with my child, ensuring that the hard-won wisdom of our family history would not be lost again. The true inheritance Henry left was not measured in dollars or property deeds, but in the opportunity to build a life and legacy based on creation rather than acquisition. Every piece of furniture that emerged from my workshop, every sustainable building developed through the restructured Wright properties, and every student who learned traditional crafts at the innovation centers would carry forward that inheritance in ways no financial transaction could capture. 6 months had transformed what began as painful humiliation into unexpected liberation. $2 bills, intended as a final rejection, had instead become the first page of a new chapter in the Wright family story, one written with more compassion, authenticity, and purpose than what had come before. Have you ever had to forgive someone who deeply hurt you in order to move forward with your own life? What helped you find the strength to choose healing over resentment? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this journey from betrayal to redemption resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with others who might find hope in knowing that sometimes the greatest gifts arrive disguised as our deepest disappointments. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that true legacy is built one principled choice at a time.